Thank you so much for joining us today. I think you have a couple opening remarks you'd like to make.
Yes, well, yes, okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming. And I've been asked to say something about how I became a writer. I loved writing when I was a child, but when I was growing up in China in the 1950s and 60s, it was impossible even to dream of becoming a writer. Because in those years, China was under the tyranny of Mao, and all writers were more or less condemned. Some were denounced, some were sent to the Gulag, some were executed. And even writing for oneself was dangerous. I remember writing my first poem on my 16th birthday. It was in the middle of the Cultural Revolution, when books were burned across China. And I wrote this poem, and I was lying in bed polishing my poem when I heard the door banging. Red Guards had come to raid our flat, and I had to quickly rush to the bathroom to tear up my poem and flush it down the toilet, because it was dangerous, and if they saw it, it would be a disaster to my family and to myself. But that ended my first attempt at writing. But the desire to write never left me. And in the following years, I was exiled to the edge of the Himalayas and worked as a peasant and as a barefoot doctor. A barefoot doctor was a doctor without any training, because Mao said, the more books you read, the more stupid you become. So that was the guideline for health and education. And then I became a steel worker and then an electrician. Again, there was no training. I had 5 electric shocks in a month. But when I was spreading manure in the paddy fields, and when I was checking electricity supplies on top of the electricity poles, I was always writing in my head with an invisible pen. I just couldn't put pen to paper. And then in 1976, Mao died, and things began to change. And in 1978, I passed, by that time, for some 10 years, schools were either closed or were not doing proper teaching, and universities were the same. And then schools and universities began to reopen properly after Mao died. And scholarships for going abroad were awarded on academic basis. And I sat for exam, I did well, I became one of the first group of Chinese to come and study in Britain. And my group had 14 people. And I was the first person from Sichuan province, a province then of 90 million people, to come and study in Britain. So when I arrived, when I got my doctorate from the University of York in 1982, because I was so lucky, I was the first person to get a doctorate from communist China. Now, when I arrived in Britain, I could then write, but then somehow the desire to write left me, because I had come to a completely different world. It was like a landing on Mars. Everything was different. I mean, the group of 14 of us were all wearing the Mao suit. We were not allowed to go out on our own. We had to move in a group, and we were quite a sight in the London streets. And I was the first person to do many things, including going into a bar, because the Chinese translation for the bar is 酒吧, which in those years suggested somewhere indecent with nude women gyrating. So we were particularly warned never to go into a bar. But I discovered there was a bar across the street from the university. And one day I sneaked out of the university. I darted across the road. I went into the bar, and I saw nothing of the kind, only some old man sitting there drinking beer. And I was very disappointed, of course. And so life was tremendous fun, you know, I was discovering everything new. And then to write would be to look backward and inward into a past I wanted to forget all about. In the Cultural Revolution, my father was one of the few who stood up to Mao and protested the Cultural Revolution. And he was arrested, tortured, driven insane, and he died prematurely, very tragically. My grandmother, beloved grandmother, who really brought us up, also died. And my mother was put through over 100 of these denunciation meetings because she refused to denounce my father. And my mother was made to kneel on broken glass. She was paraded in the streets when children spat at her and threw stones at her. And she was exiled to a camp, but she survived. And today she still lives in Chengdu in China. She's 90, I'm very pleased to say, and still a tower of strength for me. And but the past was very painful for me when I arrived in Britain in 1978. And so I just wanted to enjoy myself, and I told people I was from South Korea, so they wouldn't ask me painful questions about China. So for 10 years, I didn't want to write. And then in 1988, my mother came to London to stay with me. For the first time, she told me the stories of her life and the stories of my grandmother and her relationship with my father. And once my mother started, she couldn't stop. She stayed with me for 6 months, and she talked every day. And when I was out working, I was teaching at SOAS, University of London, in those years. And my mother talked into a tape recorder. When I was listening to my mother, and I said to myself, I've got to write all this down. And then I also realized how much I wanted to be a writer, and how much I had always wanted to be a writer. And it also seemed that my mother knew I had this cherished, unspoken dream, and she was helping me to fulfill the dream, because otherwise she wouldn't have talked into the tape recorder when I was not there. And so when she left London, she left me 60 hours of tape recordings. And I sat down, I transcribed the tapes, and I just had this urge to write, and that's how I wrote Wild Swans, which was published first in 1991. And soon afterwards, I came to Oxford Uni. Actually, I gave a talk then. And so Wild Swans changed my life. I became a writer. I realized my dream, my childhood dream, and became a writer. And after that, I went on to write a biography of Mao with my husband, John Halliday, who is actually from Oxford, who came to Oxford University. He was also interested in Mao. And so we decided to embark on this project together. We divided our research by language because I'm Chinese, so I dealt with the Chinese language sources. Jung, unfortunately, speaks many languages, so he was landed with the rest of the world. And in particular, he knows Russian and spent a lot of time working in the Russian archives, which turned out to be a treasure trove. And we were very lucky in the 1990s because Russia, under Yeltsin, opened its archives, which have since been closed by Putin. And in China, it was also the golden time of research because the historical witnesses were still alive. And also it was relatively liberal. I mean, even though Wild Swans was banned in China, I could still travel in China in those years and interviewed hundreds of people who knew Mao well. And various other research. We had great fun, John and I. We spent 12 years of our life working on this book together. We interviewed just about anyone who has interesting dealings with Mao, and including this man called this former president of Zaire, now Congo, Mobutu Sese Seko. I don't know whether you heard of him. He was very famous in those years. He was supposed to have strangled his opponents with his bare hands at his dinner table. And we wanted to interview him because China was onto Africa in those years, even in those years, in 1960s, 70s. And we wanted to interview him. And then one day in Hong Kong, after our research trip to China, in 1996, I think, and John was in the bathroom reading his local paper. And he suddenly shouted, "Guess who is staying in this hotel? It's Mobutu. Shall we find somebody to introduce us?" Now I said, "Oh, John, I've done 2-month interviews. I'm exhausted. I'm going to the hair salon." So I went to the hotel hair salon, and 10 minutes later, who but Mobutu strutted in. He sat in this chair with bits of cotton wools around his head, towels around his neck, shoulder, and he was under this hair thing, that thing that blows steam into your hair for treatment, and he was trapped. So I was able to pause when I was led to have my hair rinsed. I was able to pause in front of Mobutu and ask him for an interview. And we got our interview, which was very exciting. The other person's Imelda Marcos. Have you heard of her? She's the former First Lady of the Philippines. Well, she had a flirtatious relationship with Mao because, I mean, she dressed in this glorious Filipino national dress. And when she met Mao in 1974, Mao was nearly blind, but Mao was a womanizer. So his eyes sparkled when he saw Imelda, and he picked up Imelda's hand and kissed her hand. This gesture was deemed to be bourgeois gesture, and it would subject to people normally in denunciation meetings. And so Mao's photographer, whom we interviewed, didn't dare to take a photograph, but the newsreel camera was rolling and recorded this moment. So I then saw it like everybody in China in the newsreel, because there were no films in China in those years. Cinemas were converted to torture chambers. My mother was imprisoned in the main cinema in Chengdu. And now, but the only films we were able to see were these newsreels. So we all saw Mao kissing Imelda Marcos. And Madame Mao also saw this, and she was very jealous because, like the rest of the Chinese women, she was only allowed to wear this sort of uniform, not flattering. I mean, she looked terrible. She was dying to, I mean, she's felt very jealous. In fact, Imelda could see that she was looking very jealous. And she also noticed Mao flirting with Imelda. So she then decided to design a national uniform for Chinese women. But her design was terrible. I mean, in those years, even though we were hungry for pretty clothes, but her design met with universal scorn. But since she was designing dresses, and so we were allowed to wear skirts. I mean, I wore my first skirt in 1970, adult in 1975, and this was thanks to Imelda Marcos. Anyway, we had great fun in addition to working in the archives, in dozens of archives around the world, and interviewing fascinating people. We wrote this book. I better finish very soon. But the most important things I think we discovered was, you heard of this Chinese famine, yeah? 1958 to 1961. Some 40 million people died of starvation and overwork. And we all knew about the famine, but why? I mean, there were many explanations, blaming the weather, etc., and so on. Or Mao's ignorance in economics, which was true, but it was not the main reason. The main reason was that Mao had a dream. Actually, he started this Chinese dream, and which was to turn China into a first-rate military superpower, so he could dominate the world. He had this dream ever since he seized China in 1949, and but China was very poor in those years, but Mao wanted to buy all the military factories from the Soviet Union. And what did he have to pay for these very expensive purchases? And Mao decided to export food. The food he knew the Chinese were dependent on for survival, to exchange for these military factories. I mean, he knew his people were dying of starvation. But he didn't care. He said for all his projects to take off, maybe half of China will have to die. Now, okay, so that was the biography of Mao. And afterwards I wrote, I can see the clock ticking, I better talk about the other things later. I then wrote a biography of the Empress Dowager Cixi, who, unlike Mao, whose portrait is still hanging on Tiananmen, whose corpse is still lying in the center of the Chinese capital for people to worship. His face is on every banknote. I mean, this man who had caused 70 million, the death of 70 million Chinese in peacetime, but they still worshipped today. The Empress Dowager was the woman who brought China from a medieval society into the modern age. She's done tremendous good for China, but not surprisingly, she is the big evil woman in Chinese history books, and is blamed for being the cause of the so-called 100 years humiliation. But I became fascinated in her because when I realized that she was the person who banned foot binding, which my grandmother suffered. But when I was researching Wild Swans, I realized this, and I became very curious in her. And then when I was researching Mao, I realized how much freedom Mao had in his youth. I mean, which I couldn't dream of many decades later under Mao. So I wrote this biography of the Empress Dowager. She was a fascinating woman. And then after that, to answer my next question, which is what happened in those 40 years between the death of the Empress Dowager in 1908 and Mao seizing power in 1949. I mean, the Empress Dowager had set the ball rolling to turn China into a constitutional monarchy, and yet Mao, 40 years later, plunged China into this totalitarian hell. And what happened in those 40 years? The three Song sisters and their husbands, Sun Yat-sen, the so-called the father of China, and Chiang Kai-shek, the predecessor of Mao, their stories are the answers to this question. Of course, then they go on much longer, including Taiwan and so on. So that's how then I wrote these 3 books, which I'm very happy to say I regard them as my own trilogy of modern China and its main personalities. Now that's a happy ending to my 30 years of research and writing.
Wow, that's incredible. Thank you so much for that. Just starting with you providing illumination how the stories of the 3 sisters provides us with explanation for the gap between. I wonder, from my perception, especially for why you are today, it seems to be a sense of rebellion against what you feel isn't right. From you flushing down your poetry when you lived in a state where people weren't allowed to have books and art, to the work that your dad did. I wonder whether you could tell us where you feel the spirit in this inner rebellion came from, but more importantly, how you feel that it had served you throughout the years in your writing. So like your resistance to the current status quo.
Well, the thing is, after Wild Swans was published, do you know this writer? I suddenly. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Somebody reviewed the book and said this was unforgettable, very nice words, portrait of the brain death of a nation. And indeed, in those years, particularly the 10 years of Cultural Revolution between 1966 and 1976, I mean, as I said, no books, no museums, no theaters, no cinemas. China was a cultural desert. People were in a state of brain death. But I also realized that actually your brain is this incredible thing. It will keep functioning. It will keep trying to find a way to find out the information and to think for itself. So that's that's how what happened to me, and I think I got this urge to grab every bit of information that leaks through the regime's totalitarian shield, and I was able to read more than 1,000 foreign and Chinese classics, because I had a very entrepreneurial 13-year-old brother who loved collecting. He collected stamps and so on before the Cultural Revolution, and then all these were not allowed, were condemned as a bourgeois habit. So, like many others, he turned to collect these badges of Mao. And in those days, we all had to wear these badges. So there were many sizes and materials, qualities. So people became connoisseurs in the Mao badge. And my brother collected a lot of Mao badge. That's one thing that you can have without pay. And so he collected a lot of them, and he dealt at the black market. And with the money, he bought these foreign and Chinese classics at a books black market, because people didn't want to have their books burned, and they would sell their books at the black market. And sometimes, looking at all these books, my father had a huge collection of books lined up like this, and they were all burned. And he was even forced to burn his own books, which was the moment he had a mental breakdown. So people who have these books were being beaten up at these bloody house raids. So people then sold their collections as scrap paper, and the scrap paper shop, to make a profit, would then sell them at these black markets. And my brother used the money he made dealing in the Mao badges to buy these books, and he collected more than 1,000 copies, and he buried them we lived in a compound in those days under a big water tower. There were some underground facilities to bury them there. And so I was able to read these books, and they opened my mind.
Wow. It's incredible how your brother's eclectic collection was helpful in that regard. And I understand that with Wild Swans, your mother's recordings of her life was a starting point for that wonderful autobiography. What was your first thoughts when you heard those recordings? And if you take us back to how you might have felt.
When I heard my mother, I just felt my mother had this urge to be understood by me, and then I realized that my overwhelming feeling was how much I want to write it down, how much I loved writing. I've loved writing all my life, and now I suddenly realized that I should write. Of course, at that time, none of us knew Wild Swans was going to be a success, but I was spared of the anxiety of how the book would go by the protection of my mother. Because my mother wrote to me just before the publication that, the book might not do well, people might not pay attention to it, but you are not to worry. And she said, because through writing the book, I can feel that you understand me more. And indeed, my love for my mother came to a new level. My understanding of her. And my mother said that made her a happy woman. And so that was enough, she said. And that was indeed, Wild Swans turned out to be a wild success. And my mother, who had initially only wanted understanding from her daughter, now has the understanding of tens of millions of people all over the world. The book has been translated into more than 40 languages, so that was wonderful. It was something we didn't initially think of, but it turned out this way, so that's the best way.
Amazing. Speaking about identity, the start of the book focuses on the lives of your relatives in pre-war China, a society dominated by Asian cultural traditions and attitudes. And overwhelmingly, those traditions have possibly been eroded deliberately by successive governments of China. I wonder whether you think that this might have possibly eroded much of the uniqueness of Chinese culture.
Chinese, I think when I wrote Wild Swans and indeed the other books, I focused on these individuals, their stories. I wasn't thinking of giving a history lesson or a cultural lesson, because I think all cultures are unique. and yet they share many things in common. And all individuals are unique, and yet we share many things in common. I'm someone who is colorblind. I think, sort of, it is okay. And also I don't look at people's background. Don't look at people and immediately think what their roots might be or their culture might be, because I think I find the same things in different people, different things in the person. Now, I have answered your questions. Yes, but of course, when I was writing about the stories of these individuals, the big landscape of China and the modern China was always at the back of my mind, because Wild Swans basically is this average people being confronted by history, and the other three biographies are people who made history, who decided how China, whose actions decided the course of China. And so it's important that this much of my research is about that background, and my research, if I may say, have turned out many unknown and untouched ground. So unknown things and untouched ground. So I'm very happy that people could also read from these individual stories the larger picture of what has happened in China.
Amazing. You being someone who touches on unknown parts, coming as the first generation of the Chinese students must have been quite a unique experience. You've touched on that a little bit. I wonder what specifically it was like being a 26-year-old and going into your own experiences as a PhD student in the University of York. What unique experiences from then do you think you reflect on now very, very fondly, given how the last 30 years you lived here and you still sort of like cling on to it with deep nostalgia?
Well, when I first came, of course, it's, as I said, it was like landing on Mars. I mean, everything was new. You can't imagine how absurd Mao's China was. And one thing Mao turned against were flowers. I mean, flowers and plants, and he called cultivating them bourgeois habit. And as a school child, I had to go out with my fellow students to try to remove the grass from the school lawn. And later in the Cultural Revolution, these things did return. But by the time I came to Britain, the parks in China were derelict. I mean, they were vandalized, wasteland. So when I came on my first day when I was allowed out, I walked in the Hyde Park. I just, it was so green to me. I mean, so wonderful. I mean, it was like really everything pleasurable in China in those days was banned, was not even banned. I mean, just been turned into something bad. So I just enjoyed myself so much. I mean, as I said, I told people I was from South Korea. When I was about the first mainland Chinese to have gone out on my own. I mean, I went out secretly because China was changing. I mean, so I started to break the rules. And when we first came to China, we were only told to move in groups. But then I found that people were so curious about China, just about China, because it had been closed. I grew up in China until I was 26. And the first time I spoke to a foreigner was when I was 23, when I was an English language student at Sichuan, when universities were tentatively reopening some universities, and I wrote about it in Wild Swans. I was lucky enough to get into Sichuan University to learn English, but still, our textbooks were written by Chinese teachers who'd never seen foreigners before. And the first lesson was Long Live Chairman Mao. And the second lesson was greetings, because in China in those years, if we bumped into each other, we say, 吃饭了吗？上哪儿去? Which means, where are you going? Have you eaten? So those were the English greetings I learned. So when I first came to London, I used to go around ask people whether they had, where they were going, whether they had eaten. And you can't believe the difference between the closed door China in those days and the opening up from 1978. And so the people were so curious. And so that's my experience. I loved Britain. I come to a kind and just, or at least trying to be just, society, and one of my first impressions was that Britain was wonderfully classless, and because in China, Mao's China in those days, we had to fill in endless forms, and on every form there is an item family background, because there were outcasts, there were class enemies, there were supposedly red families. And because my parents were communist officials, and every time I filled this with red, I'd sigh with relief, because I could see my fellow pupils were this sort of psychological damage this did to them. And also my family lived in this compound with armed guards and chauffeurs and cooks. So I grew up very much taking hierarchy and the privilege for granted. That's why I thought England was wonderfully classless. Of course, my views have been modified over the years.
Yeah, no, thank you. In an earlier interview, you talked about how perhaps your heart is still in China. And of course, the last couple of years has seen different developments. If you were to revisit where home is for you, and given that your books currently, and the effect of how the books were banned, do you feel a part of you still not fully whole, being away and also not being able to connect fully with your place of origin in your art as well?
Yes, I think when I said, my heart was in China, that was probably in the late 1990s, early 20s. I mean, since then, of course, my views have been modified. In those years, China was really relatively, even after Tiananmen, it was unbelievably free compared to today. In terms of research, in terms of studies, in terms of thinking, and also just after writing Wild Swans, which brought me back to this land where I was born, and I felt a particular urge to be. I felt, I don't no longer want to say I'm South Korean. I just wanted to, and I feel very emotional about China. And particularly when I go back in the 80s and 90s, when I see the flower market reopened, the tea houses where as a student I was forced to go, and with many other pupils to close. That tea house reopened, and which made my trip to China so happy when I sat there and saw these people playing chess, just relaxing, and or many other things. And of course, as we all know, since Mr. Xi came to power, and China has taken a huge step backward, and particularly I wouldn't dream of, when I was giving interviews, I said I don't think anyone in China wanted to go back to Mao's days. And I was really astonished that people like Mr. Xi do want to go back to Mao's days and, do want to drag China back to those days. I witnessed the starvations, I witnessed the horrible, horrible torture and brutality in the Cultural Revolution, people committing suicide, just horrible. I mean, anyone wanting to live in those years, I mean, really was beyond my understanding. And now since 2013, when Mr. Xi came to power, I mean, through the propaganda, through brainwashing, as also the new generations grow up, and they haven't lived in the old days. They couldn't dream of the old days. Things were like that, and they thought all these people talking about the bad old days were somehow exaggerating, were lies, were untruth. I feel very sad. I feel I no longer feel that kind of connection. I mean, home is really where my husband is, the place I admire, feel most comfortable in, which is in London. Plus that, I mean, I think I'm persona non grata in China. So it's a very, very sad story. I do hope, I mean, he's not going to, Mr. Xi is not going to get his way to drag China backwards, but just the thought of wanting to do so, and so many people wanting to do so, it seems, at least to say they want to do so. It's just so sad.
Yeah, I think for many around the world, your story kind of presents a beacon of hope. Having listened and read your works and knowing what your father went through, the punishments and public humiliation your mom went through, and all those tragedies, but still making it and making art out of it and being able to convey that message to the world in a beautiful way. I wonder what message you'd have to people in the world right now who, as we can see, the states of different parts of the world are going through forms of destitution, are going through forms of conflict, or perhaps leaders of their country not treating things in the most optimum way. What words of hope and inspiration would you give to the young June in anywhere in the world today?
Well, I mean, obviously, the first thing is Putin must not be allowed to win, to get his way. I mean, that sort of, I'm consumed with this war. I'm full of admiration for the Ukrainians, and just really want to do everything we can to stop these sort of horrible things, war amongst the others, from happening again. So I think just let your brain fly, whatever. Use your brains and just do because I think, brain death is the worst possible thing that can happen to people and to a society. So keep your brain alive is what I would, live and full of energy and full of creativity, full of pleasure, fun, and goodwill, kindness, and it's what I genuinely feel.
Amazing. That's very deep. Thank you. I'm keen to open up to questions to the floor now. I would like anyone who would like to ask any question to identify themselves by raising up their hands. Sure. I recognize the gentleman in the blue jacket.
Yeah, thank Thank you very much for your talk. I've actually had the rather dubious honour of being on the inside of modern China for several years, where we have constant socialist propaganda, 100-year anniversary monuments that never went down after the anniversary, assaults on on foreign textbooks, foreign teachers, and all of that. And some people on the internet are trying to say that this might be a cultural revolution 2.0. Given the horrors of Cultural Revolution 1.0, do you think that these people are exaggerating, or do you think there might be something to that comparison?
Yes. Okay, very good. I hear this often, and I think people, when they say Cultural Revolution, they really they don't mean this exact period, which is 1966 to 1976, and the period I lived through. I mean, they are thinking of the old rule, bad old days in general. I mean, like, it's not a precise expression. Nothing of you just quoted can begin to compare with what really happened in the Cultural Revolution. But on the other hand, I think there is no harm in people evoking this word, the Cultural Revolution, because that was really the period, I think nearly everybody in China suffered tremendously. I mean, the people who didn't suffer really would, I would say enjoyed, maybe torturers who loved torturing. I mean, I dare say everybody in China, even Mr. Xi, whose father suffered tremendously, nearly died, and he himself was banished to the villages and as a peasant. So I think there is no harm in people saying, I mean, people who don't know what Cultural Revolution was really like, they just associated with the thing, one word, bad. I mean, so I think it's no harm in people saying that.
Thank you. Any other questions? Sure. Just wait for the mic.
Hi, my name is Liam. I'm doing a master's in law, and my question is, as a person who's gone through the Cultural Revolution in different capacities, what do you think is the most fatal thing that leads people to engage in the kind of mob mentality and cult of personality that led to the Cultural Revolution? And yeah.
Okay. Yes, that is a most interesting question. Well, I think all those things could only happen because of the most important. There have to be two things. One is deprivation of information. We absolutely had no information. I mean, China was seamlessly closed. So that's why today it's impossible, whatever bad things they do, it's not like the Cultural Revolution, because the door that has been opened can't be closed again. So there are many channels of information. I mean, if you really want, you can find out the truth. So that's different from the Cultural Revolution. The other most important thing about Mao's rule, particularly the Cultural Revolution, is fear, intense fear, that the fear that can make you do anything. And Mao knew this very well, like some other dictators, and he knew the fear factor is the most important factor for their rule. So the first phase of the Cultural Revolution in 1966 was to generate fear. And Mao's enemies in the Cultural Revolution were his party colleagues. And he must generate a fear that can override people's fear for the party. So Mao, in order to generate the fear, Mao incited violence in schools and universities. Nearly all schools and universities in China were in atrocity, where people are committing atrocities. My school, I saw those things. I mean, the teachers, I saw my teacher, one of the teachers, being beaten mainly by the boys who she was very strict with them, or maybe dismissive or whatever. They hated her basically, and so there was the Cultural Revolution. They found the chance to vent their anger, so they tortured her, beat her up. Most horrible. And another teacher, in fact my English language teacher, was made to stand on this bench, bent head down with the arms twisted to the back. He was elderly, he fell, his head cut on the bench and the blood was pouring down. We all had to watch that. The whole school had to gather on the sports field when these teachers were being abused and beaten. We were all brutalized in that way, and everybody in China saw brutal things, and this sort of a fear grew in everybody, which is why people, why so many, I think one reason why so many people still worship Mao, because they feared Mao so. I mean, the gods the Chinese worshipped were terrible, make terrible things happen. I mean, so the more you fear somebody, the more it seems they worship somebody. And so that fear, I mean, today, Mr. Xi is unable to generate that kind of fear. And because, I mean, this is also because you go back to Chinese history, this is Mao had been able to create that sort of atmosphere through many decades work. So thank God. I don't think we can really return to those years. But those are very good questions. And even the deprivation of information. No parents dare to tell their children what happened, what they thought, because they just feared that children might blab, and which would bring disaster to the family and children. And so every parent in China in my years say to their children, do as Chairman Mao says. And when we were children, if we wanted to say what I say is true, we would swear, we would say, I swear to Chairman Mao. The kind of fear, I mean, Mr. Xi, many people ridiculed him on the internet. I mean, you get deleted, but most people don't get to be executed.
We have time for one more question. I recognize the gentleman in the blue, lovely top.
Hi, thank you very much. My question is, across the decades that you've lived in the United Kingdom, how have you found that public perception of China and Chinese people and Chinese issues has changed as the leadership of China and China's position in the world has changed?
Well, I think when I first came, people didn't know what China was like, and people were full of curiosity. And then I think, along with the opening up of China, people had a lot of goodwill towards China. I mean, personally, I've not experienced any racist act, but this might be because I was a student, then I was a teacher, I was a writer. I'm sort of, in a way, I lived a more isolated life, and the people around me are unlikely to. I can't imagine they will be racist. So there was a lot of goodwill, until I think fairly recently, when people realized what, a lot of the things that are happening, particularly since Mr. Xi came to power. So they have this rather, I don't know, is that true? I mean, you have to tell me, because as I said, I lived a very rather isolated life as a writer. I think people began to see a truer China. this, but on the other hand, I wouldn't say before when this goodwill were happening. I mean, China was changing incredibly and in a good direction, mostly in a good direction. In the 1980s, 1990s, one could still, the society was liberalizing in many ways. So have I answered your question? And I think now, yes, Mr. Xi has this dream, and his dream is inherited from Mao. He wanted to impose, it's not Mao's tyranny, but that sort of thing on the world. He wanted to dominate the world. And I mean, people now have seen this, and it's unlikely, the world is unlikely going to allow that to happen.
Wow, thank you so much, June. I was incredibly nervous to listen to you, but you've made it an incredibly special session, and I'm so grateful. Could we all join me in thanking for everything?
Thank you. Thank you, thank you. Thank you. Okay, thank you. Good, thank you.